So anyway, listen, I've been a bit silly today. I've been a little bit sort of funny with some of these introductions, so I'm just going to chill. It's the last one. I'm just going to go with what Josh put in their talk description here. Let me just find it here, right? So Josh, what do you do with old computer? Right, here's what they wrote. Um, Josh is running out of time for the CFP, but they hope they can write a more complete bio and ship it later. Give it up for Josh.
Thank you, James. Yes, welcome to my talk. I'll be talking about old computer stuff. It's a bit different from your regular Dev World fare, but not that different for me. Amy said it better, but I could not resist the opportunity to use the color tools in HyperCard to put colored rectangles in a slide. So here they are. It's traditional to open a talk with stuff about the speaker, so I'm now going to self-indulge. A number of months ago, I left that place, and now I work for this other place. They're not comparable in the slightest, to be honest. BuildKite is somehow even better than the Big G. And if you're interested in CI platform where you kind of like Jenkins but not crap, then talk to me. I've been there for a few months, but I'm really liking it. But while I'm self-indulging, I thought I'd give a bit of background. So I'm old enough to know what the life was like before the internet ate everything. I also happen to have grown up in a family that kind of like lagged getting a PC. We had a 386 Windows thing for quite a while, many years after they became obsolete. But I was jealous of my friends at school who had newer things or more fun things like Amigas. You know, what was I to do? Get used to it? Oh, sorry. I don't know if this is going to make sense to like younger people than me. Let me just fix this. Yeah, see, we used to use punctuation like that to, let's just rotate that right, to describe our emotions in text. That's probably a more modern representation of it. So let me just hide that again. Boop. Solution, get more computers, try and scavenge them from places that the school, get software from places. The tip shop was an amazing resource, even if it was damaging my CD drive, and build a cluster. Now, did I know how to make a cluster? No, I had no idea. I was a teenager. But did I know what I was going to do with a cluster once I made it? Also no. I liked fractals, maybe I could render some of those. But did I learn my lesson and can actually get over my addiction to acquiring computers? Again, no. I have accumulated a pile of junk. And when I started accumulating piles of junk, I saw the junk that I acquired as a source of boundless possibility. I could do literally anything with a computer. This is the way it felt at the time. But over the years, I've discovered that old computers really suck. They're slow, this is kind of obvious, but the computer sitting in front of me is probably more powerful than all the computers in the world 40 years ago. Do you want to repurpose your old computer as a web server? Well, that seems to be a common suggestion. But even in 2001, Macworld recommended not using anything older than a PowerPC. Imagine what we should be putting on the internet now. This is basically be recommending don't put anything that's got an Intel chip on it. They're generally incapable. So many missing features. You can't find a neural engine in a Mac Plus or a GPU. Well, it's got some graphical RAM, but that's about it. You can't unlock it. You can't lock it in the first place, but you can't unlock it with Touch ID. And the traditional complaint of there only being one mouse button. It won't run games that are mandatory these days, like Minecraft. It doesn't have an app store. Can't even get it on Wi-Fi. If it has Ethernet, it's going to be slow. And if you can somehow connect it to the internet, it won't do TLS. And therefore, it won't connect to any modern website. They're generally harder to use. This is simply for the reason that accessibility has improved in these years. What are files anyway? Like, yes, but we hide it. We hide it so well from people these days. If you want to interface older computers with the modern world, you need a bunch of helper electronics. Here, I've got, here's the ADB USB Wombat if you want to plug a USB keyboard into an old computer, or vice versa. If you're trying to be retro and plug an old Apple keyboard into a modern computer, you can go the other way. It's a very cool device. If you need a hard drive replacement, you need a thing like a Blue SCSI. If you want to interface via the floppy port, there's the floppy EMU, and so on and so forth. Big mess of wires are making a ton of money out of this. They're noisy. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're back in the era of fanless laptops. Steve Jobs is beaming his smiling face from heaven above. He's finally conquered the fan again. Old computers make a lot of fan noise. The hard disk spins, like there's crackling noises. If you've got really good hearing, like if you're young, old cathode ray tubes used to drive young people up the wall because they'd be humming at like 17 kilohertz. Like really high-pitched noise. And the next point, which was made better by Andy here, one thing that's really fun about microcomputers is you know for certain they're going to be enormous. Take this iMac, for instance. This is not even described as a microcomputer because it was like too new, I guess. I put that on the scales, and for comparison, like it was nearly 16 kilos. Now, I guess they're not meant to be carried around, but they do have a handle on the back, so it makes you think wonder what they were thinking. They're bulky. Like I didn't pour liquid into the iMac to find out what its volume was, but if you just multiply its linear dimensions, it's about 55 liters. They're full of crap. Heavy metals, toxins, brominated flame retardants. Depending on the age of the machine, there are reasons these are phased out of manufacturing. And if you do dare to open them up yourself, anything with a cathode ray tube, you're liable to get an electric shock because the flyback transformer generates thousands of volts. Now, in I think it was 2017, I brought a Mac Plus. Sadly, I did not bring a Mac Plus this year. I would have, but I was just in Japan and I didn't want to lug it around. So I brought the Mac Plus, and unfortunately it broke that year at DevWorld. But don't worry, I fixed it. More about that later. Old computers, they last, but sometimes they don't. And this one is particularly important, I think, for us. An important part of being a retro computerist is being able to tell the difference between interesting and useful. And this isn't the interesting point. The interesting point, I thought, was the response. I'm seeing this in the vintage Apple community right now. The Intel Macs are so old that by all measures, they should be considered just as interesting as other vintage Macs. Did you know the first Intel Macs hit the shelves 17 years ago? Does that make anyone feel young? So, old computers are terrifying. But so are old cars. Like, you can still drive this on the road. You can probably still get parts to fix it. You can make it road legal. You can get a license for it. What's the difference, right? Well, in order to understand, it's important to ask how we got here. As a reference for other old people, this is, yeah, weird music videos. I want to introduce you to the concept of a Wardley map. This is by a guy called Simon Wardley. He's British, and he invented one of these concepts to sort of explain how technology evolves and how companies' strategies can be, worked through. So basically, imagine a graph where on the vertical axis we have like things that are more visible at the top, like more visible to the public, more visible to the users, and on the low end is things that are largely invisible. And then going from left to right, we have things that are experimental, like just invented, literally groundbreaking science, and on the right we have things that have become commonplace and commodities and just like mass market produced. Kind of as an example, I plotted a few things. Here's stuff to do with electricity production, right? Tony Stark's arc reactor doesn't exist, so it's purely experimental, but everyone's watched a Marvel film, so they probably know about it. And we can go along further to the right, we find things that are more visible. This is if you're thinking about electricity, you're thinking about these things, so they're near the top. Down the bottom, though, what we don't see is mining the lithium and the coal that goes into the batteries and the coal generator. And when you're dealing with your phone, that's the thing that's in front of you. You're hardly thinking about the electricity that's powering it, unless you're out of battery. So, to talk about computer history, we should probably start here. Who knows what this thing is? Okay. Well, okay. No, it's really old. This is Cyrac. Yeah. It ran at the whopping speed of 1,000 instructions per second. It needed something like 30 kilowatts of power to run. And I'd not even get into how big and heavy it was. Like, it was not as big and heavy as other later computers even, but it was pretty big. And all the people that ran it are basically in their 90s now. So we can basically say it's down there. Like, to the people in the world at the time probably didn't know or care about Cyrac. Only the people that ran it, it was kind of like their job. And it was one of the first computers, so it was clearly very experimental. If you keep following this train of thought, you end up with a bunch of stuff. I put in some Mac-related things and drew some lines kind of like representing dependencies there. So to take the Macintosh, for instance, that was marketed as a product. It was manufactured. What made it possible were commodity products like integrated circuits. Right? That's what kicked off the microcomputer revolution. The ability to put all the processing in a single chip. Similarly, we can refer to apps that ran on the computers. VisiCalc was an example of a killer app for the Apple II. And more recently, we have things like the iPhone. They're commodity. They're everywhere. Everyone has one. And they have killer apps too. TikTok, Instagram. I'm sure you can come up with other examples. Now, we can certainly, let's just, one of the key things about a Wardley map is that you can basically argue about where these things should be. Like, should the iMac G3 be more of a earlier product or a later product, or is it more of a commodity thing? It was certainly very visible because that's when Steve Jobs returned to Apple and really promoted it. Well, maybe it's actually less important than the new iMacs. I don't know. But with retrocomputing, what we find is that unlike current products, which are built on commodity parts that are highly refined, we're now seeing we need a bunch of supporting electronics that are more experimental or bespoke in nature. So we have this kind of backwards effect where things are becoming less refined. It's more wild. Retro stuff depends on compatibility gadgets. Meanwhile, all the money has moved to the top right corner where there are killer apps and the platforms that are selling the shovels that you use to build the killer apps, the Xcodes and Apples of the world. And they hide the infrastructure from app developers and users and whatever. Cool. So the answer to how we got here is basically capitalism. Now, I'm not necessarily saying capitalism is bad. I personally think it might be. But we got here because the new thing, if it wasn't better, no one would pay for it. And the only reason old hardware is not supported anymore is because it would cost the companies money to support them. Right? Okay, so what about, I don't know, security? Surely these old devices are insecure. Well, that's, again, just a matter of cost. Apple could make these old computers work with the modern internet if they really wanted to put the money in. So, to summarize, old gadgets really only suck in comparison to new gadgets. And that's bad because all the new stuff that we've got is one day going to be old. If you want to get into retrocomputing, keep your new stuff that you've got now and just hold on to it for a really long time. Because they don't spontaneously cease to exist. And I wanted to make a point about right to repair, but I think for a crowd of software developers, it might be interesting to ask yourselves, well, what's the software equivalent of that? So, I mean, one answer to this is, what about open source? And that's fair. But another example might be scripting your apps. And what I mean by that is AppleScript is an interface to control various apps and has been built into the app platform for years. That's a way that users can add their own functionality and effectively repair the app to do what they want. So what do people do with old computers? They do all sorts of things. They keep using them. They hoard them. They give them away. What you're supposed to do is use the trade-in program or e-waste recycling. What you're definitely not supposed to do is put them in the bin. Don't put anything with a lithium battery in the bin. Normal people, it turns out, do continue using their computers for quite a while. On my holiday over the last 2 weeks, I saw at least 3 2011 MacBook Airs. We're the weird people who constantly upgrade our machines. And we're probably also hoarding our old machines as well. I know I have a cupboard full of these. So what will retro computing of the future look like if, we're hoarding today's Apple Watches? I don't know. That's a tough one. Apple Watches aren't that easy to get stuff on in the first place. So, we can resell them. And to talk about resale, I wanted to take us on a little trip to Japan. Oh, crap. Sorry, I've misspelled this. Let me just fix this. Is that gonna... No. Come on. This worked before. Costume change. Socks. Haido menu bar. Konnichiwa, minasan. Welcome to Akihabara. This is Tokyo's electric town. This is where you go to find maid cafes, you go to find gacha games, you go to hang out with friends, and you go to find weird electronics. Here is a photo I took in a company called SoftMap. They have prime electric town frontage, and this is on the second floor. Like, the first floor is like used iPhones and Samsungs and stuff. This is second floor. This is so easy to get into. And they have like huge store. This is their used Mac department, basically. And here we can see nearly 10 years of Mac development as well. We have the middle shelf with the Trashcan Mac Pro, released in late 2013. And then right above it, an M1 Ultra Mac Studio. That's wild. They also sold mostly laptops, but also iMacs and all sorts of other things. The MacBook Airs were very prominent. The real fun, though, was in a store that was recommended to me called Hard Off. And Hard Off specialize in old junk. Here's like the first floor of Hard Off. Bunch of old iMacs, probably still quite useful. Again, they had a display case full of MacBook Airs, MacBooks, iPads, Apple Watches. But then on the junk floor, there was this beauty. An iMac G3 with a tray loading drive in original Bondi blue, and it was only 7,700 yen, including tax. Did it work? I have no idea. Did I buy it? No. I did not have an extra 16 kilos of luggage. And besides, I've already got 2 iMacs at home. But just imagine that, again, in a city where the rent would have to be so expensive, there's a store specializing in literal junk, literal bits of useless electronics. What the hell is a Buzz? An iOmega Buzz on the right. So if you can't resell your junk, then there's e-waste. But that has problems too. I don't want to depress you too much, so I'm going to rip through this. But basically, the situation was really bad, even 10 years ago. junk would be shipped off to places that would process it. And what I'm going to describe as processing you might find a little shocking, hopefully. Most people think it goes to China. Well, a lot of it still does, but they have officially banned it for quite a while. It tends to go to third world countries and developing countries, India, Pakistan, Ghana. That photo from before was from Ghana. What they do is they basically just burn off all the gold. That's it. And if you think that burning process takes place in like a laboratory setting with like lab coats and personal safety gear, no. That's just an open flame. Another thing that's been popular lately is chip counterfeiting. They'd steal the chips off the circuit boards, blast the tops off, put new numbers on and pretend that they're new. And then the rest of it's basically either landfill or just burnt. And those toxins I meant before, well, they end up in the ground or not good. So what you should do is you should consider your retrocomputing hobby as toxic waste management, at least. And on the subject of e-waste, I thought I'd talk about Chromebooks for a second because, well, they're less popular than Macs. You can probably resell your Mac or find someone interested who has nostalgia or other kind of fetish for an old Mac. For an old Chromebook, I'm not so sure. What's happening with Chromebooks is that they're kind of like the third front in the great Apple, Google, Microsoft war for education. So Apple, I don't know if they care so much anymore, but iPads are certainly big in education. Chromebooks are the Google offering, and they're obviously lockdown Windows machines as well. School admins love Chromebooks because they're super easy to lock down hard. And parents, I guess, I'm not a parent, so I don't know, but I imagine they're popular because they're relatively cheap and make the school happy. Kid, you've got your Chromebook, go away. So they solve a problem. But the question that I have is, well, are the kids going to be nostalgic for their Chromebooks in 20 years? Or are they going to remember the misery of fighting a machine that should be working for them? I don't know. Other things people do with their old computers. Television. Here's a scene from Acapulco where there's a Macintosh 512K on the check-in desk, which is era appropriate. Although I don't really have any comments other than to say that this is a photograph of a TV displaying the episode, because if you try and screenshot Apple TV, the app, it doesn't save the image. Last of Us, those of us who have been watching that might have noticed an iMac G3. Won't spoil what where that was in. Other things that I've seen, again, back in Japan, there's a stationery store, I guess you'd call it, in Ginza called Itoya. And they had this lovely iMac on display. It's clearly one of the older ones because you can see some thick, it's got some thickness to it. But that wasn't the oldest one. I actually saw them, they had this white MacBook, the polycarbonate plastic, sitting there. Now this is, I don't know if you know about Ginza, but Ginza is like high-end shopping. It's like the primo stuff. You've got, this store is across the road from Cartier, and they're using a 2009 MacBook. There must be some aesthetic quality to it. And then closer to my home, just before going on holiday, I spotted this Pod iMac G4. And that's on and displaying some art, part of a store display. Again, it must be the aesthetic. Other things people have done have been a bit more severe. Here's something I saw wandering around Akihabara, a sign advertising a bar. That's just a light. They shelled out the innards of the computer and chucked them, I don't know. Here's a Macquarium in a Power Mac G4 Cube case. It's not the traditional Macquarium choice. Usually they just go for the Mac Plus or other beige boxy kind of Mac. And here's an iMac G3 kitten case, which is, oh, that's sweet. Who can argue with cats? Now, as a retrocomputerist, you might ask, what do I think about this? Well, it's your computer. You do what you want. But I do hope that you burnt an old, not working computer and you maybe tried to fix it, or you just didn't feel comfortable doing that, and the spare parts went to someone who can use them. But if you're thinking of doing this, like if you come across someone who's done this or has otherwise just like slap a Raspberry Pi on it, no, bad. That's so dull. You could come up with so many other things to do with the case and the parts than sticking a bloody Raspberry Pi in it. But you may have noticed that I've managed to avoid the opening question to this entire talk, which is, what do I do with my computers? And well, I guess I'll get into that now. The main thing is get a talk into DevWorld. Conference bait. But it otherwise depends. Like, so I have, in the past, given machines to my family. When I stopped using them, I had a 2012 MacBook Pro with the first one with a Retina screen. And I gave that to my parents to use for a while. And they've finally upgraded from that. And I'm glad, because it means that they're finally taking ownership of their IT life. Here's a machine I had a few years ago. It's the Trash Can Mac Pro. It's a great cupboard machine. Gotta say, there's so many upsides to using it as a little home server. Low fan noise, it's got a single fan just pushing air through it. Lots of Thunderbolt 2 ports for upgrades. Like if you want to attach some hard drives to it or more Ethernet ports or something, it comes with 2 1 gig Ethernet ports, so actually quite highly reliable. The only the only thing I've done to make it more reliable as a server is to basically just run Linux on it, and that's kind of optional. Other things that I've done lately involve the aesthetics. So again, sort of what I was mentioning before about how they've been used in store displays. So beautiful, color classic. I love you. What's special about owning real hardware is things like the screen. So although they're noisy and make high-pitched whining noises and are prone to burning out, what you can do is you can like have a look at the pixels. And they're not coming through in this photo because it's I've scaled it down to 640 by 480 to fit on this HyperCard stack. But what you can do is you can deconverge the beams, and this gives you this interesting effect where it's like I don't know. People have been faking it in games and videos lately, where the colors kind of separate.
Chromatic aberration.
Yeah, chromatic aberration. Thanks, Tim. Just like the photography technique. All right. So back to that Mac Plus that died. I quit Google. I had some time on my hands. Probably time to fix it. I had 2 choices. Once I opened it up, I figured out pretty quickly that flyback transformer had died. The flyback's that part that is big and chunky and generates high voltages. I had a choice. Should I make it like new and get the replacement parts, or should I do something more radical, shell out the innards and replace that great honking glass tube, which is coated with lead on the back, with LCD? So I tried to do both simultaneously. It was hard tracking down a replacement flyback. Most people just raid another old computer that they have. I found a website online that claimed to be from a manufacturer who was still producing them. I'm like, whoa, okay, that's interesting. But your website doesn't work. So I sent them an email like, are these parts still available? Sorry, no, we no longer make these. They're out. That's sad. So in the end, I shelled out $182.60 US on an eBay order. I hope it worked. I also needed to buy this thing. When the flyback blows, usually this other transistor blows. And I don't know if, well, so the key point here on this screenshot from Mouser is that it's marked as end of life by the manufacturer as well. So parts are running scarce. Meanwhile, I started work on the digital replacement. So I got the logic board out from the Mac Plus, and I wanted to make sure it still worked. So there it is, plugged into a couple of things, and the power supply next to it. All it really needs is 512 volts and a few other things and bits and bobs. I got to work with an FPGA. This is a great excuse to learn a completely different paradigm for programming, by the way. If you want to get into hardware development, FPGAs are a lot of fun because it's like Arduino, but you can run it really, really optimized. You just have to learn something like Verilog. I didn't actually learn hardware at uni. I just did mostly maths and software. So this was good fun for me. I had this dev board that I got at LCA once called a Arty A7. It was powerful, plenty powerful enough. And a little PMod board that let me adapt it to VGA. There it is plugged into the Macintosh logic board and running. And as you can see, it's not quite the clear picture that you would expect. It's completely wrong, in fact. Basically, my issue was timing. All I had to do was tweak the numbers, basically count the number of cycles from when each pulse came in appropriately. And then I almost got it working. But there were still a few weird flickery pixels. And this is another digital electronics issue that I wish I had learned about, called ringing. Because I was trying to down level the signals by using a pair of resistors, I had conveniently forgotten that an impedance mismatch will cause signal reflection and therefore noise. I tweaked some resistor values, and hey presto, it works. Here's a screenshot of the Mac in its Mac IP configuration dialog, just to make old people feel really old. You just have to like drag the little thing specifying where the subnet was, and my source code for this Mac to more modern thing, which is the repository name is a lie, by the way. It's more Mac to VGA still, but one day I'm going to get HDMI out. Other things I've done, well, modding. It doesn't really bug me if the computer doesn't work. So here's some good practice for modding. That color classic I showed you before, it has been modded fairly extensively at this point. It's got a Performer 580 logic board, I think, in it. The one that just slides in, well, mostly. You have to cut some of the plastic, but other than that, it attaches. It's electrically compatible, which is pretty wild to think about. I also did the VGA mod. This involved pulling the whole thing apart, cutting a few traces and soldering some more lines on, but that was also about it. It didn't involve getting a whole heap of new parts. Something that I might do in the future, well, it only has mono audio, but people have done a stereo mod where you've got two speakers in there. I think that would be pretty fun. Another thing that I've modded is the G4 Cube that Tony gave me. This computer is, by the way, a piece of art, literally in the MoMA Museum, which are also have recognized video games such as SimCity 2000, hence the t-shirt. But the G4 Cube had problems, right? It had no fan, so it was prone to overheating. It also had what was considered a fairly underpowered GPU by the time most people had one. ATI Rage 128 was kind of the stock. That's a really old GPU. Also no fan, right? So they're quite easy to get open. You basically push a handle in and it pops out, and then you can just pull the whole innards out of that acrylic box. Here it is. I wanted to upgrade the GPU. Unfortunately, the upgraded GPU I had was this NVIDIA GeForce 2 MX, and it came with another really underpowered, like tiny size heatsink on top of it. It was glued on with some weirdly strong glue. I spent forever trying to get the heatsink off this chip. I used acetone, I soaked it in all sorts of weird chemicals. Eventually it was orange oil that managed to get the glue off. But in the process, I crushed 3 of the little tiny surface mount capacitors, and I had no idea what values they were, and I didn't know if the card would work without them. I soldered some random ones on, and that seems to work. And there it is with the new heatsink, with a fan on it, and it runs really, really well. A bit noisy, but it runs really well, and it can drive a much bigger display than the one it came with. What next? Well, I've got some ideas for other retro computing projects. One is write a novel. If you've got no internet, you've got no internet distractions. Plus, the keyboards can be very nice to work with, very responsive. And why? It's because they hadn't quite figured out that you don't only need to scan the keyboard every so often, other than like hundreds and hundreds of times a second. Should I run a novelty web server? Some people do. Supposedly, someone's run a Mastodon server on something particularly old, and I want to meet them. macOS of the day began coming with a web server in it. This would be fine, but for security reasons, it's probably best to put it in front of, some kind of reverse proxy in front of it, at least a web application firewall kind of approach. And another thing is that, well, if AI is going to destroy the world, it might be handy to have some old computers it doesn't want to use. Now, having worked at a big co, it's easy to say that my favorite thing in the world somehow became the most damaging activity I could be doing with my life. That point of view kind of sucks. But really, it brings people together. Use your computers to make friends, please. If you're interested in retro computing with Macintoshes, we've just finished Macintosh online. That's the hashtag. And by the way, if you're on Mastodon and you have an old Mac, try out Mastodon. It looks like this. You will need to run a sort of a translating proxy to get it to talk to the modern web, but that's an example of that is Web 1, but that's about as hard as it gets. Computers used to be this empowering thing when they were sort of free and open and you could do all sorts of things with them. And I think it's important to make retro computing about this. Remind ourselves what computing can be. And maybe the real retro computing hobby was the friends we made along the way. But I do have one other thought. Teach kids to jailbreak Chromebooks, please. Thanks. I accidentally implemented a bouncy anvil. Doing.
Oh, that's so good. Oh dear, it's so true. My oldest daughter started high school last year, and she doesn't have a Chromebook, but they insisted she has this kind of foldable tablet / PC thing, and she's not going to love that thing. It makes me sad. We've got time for a couple of questions. If anyone has a question for Josh, yes.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, like, have you seen any sort of creative uses for retired iPhones?
Yeah, that's a good one. I used to have, well, back when I was watching certain commodity-like, stock-like things, and that was to watch a graph and like have a little ticker. I had an iPad on the wall, and I imagine like an iPhone would be kind of okay as a little desk clock or something like that. I mean, iPhones have the benefit that jailbreaks are fairly well known for the older models. I tried to also use an old Apple Watch I had, just out of interest, to see if I could get it to permanently display the clock. I couldn't figure out how to do that stock. I presume that someone's working on the jailbreak, I hope. But yeah, that's a kind of a hard one. I mean, the really old iPhones, they tend to be quite underpowered these days. You might be better off using something bigger. But yeah, yeah. I hope people are doing something with phones and so on. Yeah.
I've only been using macOS for 10 years. What version is that you're running?
Oh yeah, sure. So this is, sorry. Let me just. No, not that one. This is macOS 8.1, I want to say. Yeah, macOS 8.1 on a fake Quadra 900. The emulator is called Basilisk 2. By the way, if you just want to fiddle around with old software, just use an emulator. Emulators largely are much better than the original hardware. For instance, this thing booted up in under a second. If I was booting a real thing, it would probably be sitting there for a couple of minutes.
Any thoughts on the app stores and the fact that like a lot of the games and software that we used to use even like 10 years ago just doesn't exist anymore, and you can't run it in
yeah. I think that's well, personally I find that really sad, actually. I recently learned about an emulation project for iPhones that is aimed at there was some funny story about it being inspired by wanting to run Super Monkey Ball, which was one of the original iPhone games. And so they made an emulator. And so, you know, hopefully this situation kind of turns around. But yeah, there's kind of going to be a lot of lost software. We're in a weird dark age in that sense.
All right, I've got some news for you. It's shocking news. This is going to absolutely floor you.
It's on time.
Afternoon tea has arrived. We did it, folks. We did it. And I've heard a rumor. I don't know if this is true or not. I've heard a rumor there's mango involved in the afternoon tea in some capacities. So there's donuts. All right, so get on it, people. All right, off you go. We'll see you back 4:30, right?